Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm the host of these Chocolate Life Live episodes, and I'm also the creator and the moderator of TheChocolateLife.com. I want to thank everybody for joining me today, and what I think is going to be an extremely interesting episode here, where we're going to talk about change. And what I did was I went out on my social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, other places, and I asked people in the cocoa and chocolate industry to opine, to share with me. If they could only make one change in the way things were done, what would that one change be? And we're going to get into some of those answers, as well as some of my own responses, and see how everything works out. But before that, I want to remind everybody, please go into the comments, whatever platform you're watching on, whether it's YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook. Just give me a quick shout out. Let me know where in the world you are connecting from, and I'll get that get that up on screen. And then if you also have a question or a comment that you'd like to make over the course of the hour, put that in the comments as well. I'll get that question up and asked and answered. So before we begin, what I want to do is I want to share my screen really quickly. I want to let everybody know this is the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. If you go there, you can find the current post. It's the Chocolate Life Live, just one change. And you can click on that, and what you'll do is you'll find information and resources about today's post. And that includes, okay, here we have, at the top, I've redesigned these pages. At the top, you'll find the link to look at this at YouTube, as well as LinkedIn and Facebook, if you want to walk there. And then I follow that by information that I have about the topic. And if there are resources which are mentioned during the course of the hour, what I will do is I will add those down in the bottom of the post. So you don't have to pay attention to what the URLs are. You can pay attention to what it is that I'm saying and what it is that other people are saying during the course of the hour. So scrolling back to the top, so just one change. So what I wanted to do in this episode of The Chocolate Life was to explore the idea of affecting meaningful change. And this is going to be the first, I think, of several episodes. As a matter of fact, this coming Friday is going to be a direct follow-on to today's episode. So we'll explore the idea of affecting meaningful change in cocoa and chocolate. And I want to thank a graduate student at the London School of Economics who reached out to me on LinkedIn, Noah, and he said, I have some questions for you for my graduate thesis. And we had a conversation during the course of the conversation. The idea for this came to me. And so this is the question that I asked to people. If there was just one change, and let's make this a little larger. If there was just, I suppose, if there were grammar, if there were just one change, you could make to the way things are today in cocoa and chocolate, in the worlds of cocoa or chocolate, what would that change be? What would that one change be? And why? Now, as I was thinking about this, I thought of two particular broad categories in which the answers might fit. One of the broad categories would have been, were they regulatory changes? Were they legislative changes? And I suppose we could also throw legal changes, legal actions into that category. And then there's also the notion of, okay, are there any ideas which might be related to social pressure? So that was my prediction. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go share those responses with everyone today, starting off with LinkedIn, because on LinkedIn, I got, here is the post on LinkedIn. If you go to my profile, and you can follow me, and you can become a part of this discussion in the future. And I'll put the link to this profile onto the Chocolate Life page if it's not already there. And I copied a bunch of people into the post. It got 1,800 impressions, which is a reasonable number of impressions for me. I am going to make this a little bigger in a slightly different way. So the first, these are in order of relevance. So this is what LinkedIn thinks is relevant, and in the order. It's not the chronological order that these were done. So this is from Nick Saxby. Nick is a colleague. He works at Cocoa Runners. He manages communications at Cocoa Runners there. And he said, thanks, Clay. Great. One change that I would like to see detached from any sensible route to get to it. And I think that's a really, really important caveat. What we're looking at is what do we think are the changes we would like to see, but what we're not necessarily doing is focusing on how those changes might be implemented, which I think is a really, really important consideration to divorce the two. Because often I think that what we do is we don't bring up ideas for change because we have some idea that these might not be things that can be done. So I think it's really important that Nick made that distinction. So one change that Nick would like to see is a radical change in awareness of sustainable and ethical issues of cocoa through transparency. So he's talking about education, which I think is a social issue, and better education of social would lead to perhaps more pressure by consumers. People are interested in these issues on chocolate makers and cocoa brokers. So, okay. So one specific things he'd like to see is warnings about exploitive labor and deforestation on mass-produced chocolate packaging, similar to the health warnings on tobacco and alcohol products. Okay, so that's a legislative approach, part of regulation, which I think is interesting. And my question to anybody who might be out there, throw your response into the comments, is: do you think that these might be effective? Right? To what extent has here in the United States the mandatory, the Surgeon General has determined blah 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 blah, or similar labels on bottles of alcohol might do, and what might that label look like, and whether or not we'd actually think it is a good way to go about doing it. I know that many small chocolate makers struggle with the idea of putting nutrition labels on their bars and fitting everything that they want to fit on their bar. Having to go and put a warning label. We see Proposition 65 labels in California. Whether that would work, whether that would work or not, Nick, I think it's a really, really intriguing idea. Most customers have absolutely no idea, and if they've caught wind of the issues, a certifying green sticker or some sort is often enough to placate them. Yes, a lot of people will go and look and they'll see a little green sticker with a frog on it or something like that, and they'll go, this must be good. That is the purpose of certifications as proxies for decision making. So if manufacturers were forced, again, by regulation, to be upfront about the labor and environmental impact they perpetuate, it would radically change consumer behavior. Right, and just some dreaming for now. Yes, it might radically change consumer behavior, Nick. I would wonder whether or not that idea on its own would change the behavior of the chocolate companies or not. And I think that's a really, really interesting point to make, because we would want something in the consumer arena that had a concomitant or a corresponding change when it came to the regulations with respect to ESG, environmental sustainable governance, and things like that that are going on, especially in the EU. Now, many people might know. Oops, excuse me. This is LinkedIn telling me I have a message. I'm not going to go over to LinkedIn and push it away. But Terry Collingsworth, people will know who've followed the Chocolate Life Live and the Chocolate Life for the last couple of years. Terry Collingsworth is a lawyer. He's the founder of International Rights Advocates. He has been at the forefront of legal cases against Big Chocolate having to do with benefiting from, illegal labor in the cocoa sector in West Africa. He has also been very, very successful in putting together a program which is combating illegal labor in handmade rugs in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran, I believe, places like that. Now, what Terry is doing is, because this is relevance based on how LinkedIn looks at things, he's responding to a point we haven't got to yet, and we'll get to that, and I will jump back to this when we get there. So what he's doing is he's completely agreeing with Anna Lavin, is a colleague of mine associated with the Royal Tropical Institute KIT in the Netherlands. He agrees that with Anna, that it would be easy to determine a real living wage requirement and adjust pricing accordingly. All right, so a living wage requirement, and we'll get to it, is the notion is that there's basically a complete decoupling, um, right, in the way these pay for farmers is calculated between what the commodity cost is on the exchanges, or just the cost, the price being charged, and what the farmer is paid. That there is a decoupling of those two things. That farmers get paid living wages, independent of the what it is that they're growing and what it is they're producing. He thinks that it would be easy to determine what a real living wage requirement is and adjust the pricing accordingly. So obviously, what you do is you'd use the living wage as a benchmark baseline, and what would happen is that the price charged for cocoa would be based on would be determined in part on what that cost was, not just what it is on the commodities exchange. And in that respect, it would be very different from a living income differential, which is a premium which is charged on top of the market price for cocoa. And it's unclear how that living income differential gets distributed. Right. So want to make sure that that's that people understand that difference. I am going to do just a real quick check here. Want to make sure that yeah, my audio is working properly. I haven't heard any complaints. I just want to make sure that everything's okay. So Terry, I think that's an interesting idea. In addition, with a history and culture now developed, to use forced or cheap child labor, we would need to establish an independent monitoring and certification system. And GoodWeave is the system that Terry and international rights advocates and others helped establish in the hand-hooked rug industry, hand-knotted carpets, to ensure that farmers aren't simply getting paid more to continue using child labor. So yes, as part of that living wage system, there does need to be some sort of monitoring and enforcement system to make sure that the system is not being gamed. And I suppose one question is, how does that independent monitoring system, who's in charge of it, and how is it paid for? Because these things don't happen for free. All right. So, right, just a little homework in there. So Anthony Fountain, this is not Anthony's first response. Actually, it is his first response. So Anthony is someone I know through my work at Chocoa. We've met on several different occasions at chocolate festivals and events around Europe. And he's the managing director at Voice Network, the voice of organizations in cocoa. And they're responsible for a publication called the Cocoa Barometer. And what I will do is I will put a link to the Cocoa Barometer the into the resources for today's talk. And also Anna Lavin at KIT is in part responsible for a report on demystifying the cocoa sector in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, I believe, which has got some really, really interesting information. And I'll put a link to that KIT study, as well as the link to the Cocoa Barometer in today's notes. So Anthony is saying, if there's only one thing that he could change, right, it would be to move sustainability from the voluntary realm to the mandatory realm. Mind you, not just any kind of regulation, but one that requires continuous improvements. In other words, a properly functioning due diligence system. Right? And I think this is in part, and I think Anthony would agree, that this is being done in little steps in the current EU regulatory system. We're seeing mandatory regulations around ESG, so environmental sustainability in governments. We're seeing new regulations coming in around visibility, transparency, many people would say, when it comes to whether or not there is deforestation involved in the production of a commodity, and that companies need to certify that there is no deforestation being done, or they're not going to be able to import their products into the EU. So we're starting to see some of this regulatory structure that I think that Anthony is talking about, but it is piecemeal. And my worry is because it is being done piecemeal, there are going to be gaps which exist between the different regulations, and that people will pay very companies will work very hard to exploit the gaps. There's going to be some loopholes and some gap somewhere that they're going to be able to do, and that they're going to be able to exploit, and that's my concern. So Penelope Cabot, who, as you can see, is another person I've connected here on and LinkedIn, it responds to Anthony and says, yes, right? It seems that people in this space, and we're talking cocoa and chocolate, but I would argue that people in every space, when it comes to agricultural commodities that rely on illegal labor at any level, right? They only respond to sticks. So yes, she also believes that the business models need a radical overhaul to take a greater share of the spoils to the cocoa growing landscapes. And so when I think we talk about, when I talk about sustainability, let's use my definition. I use the three pillars of environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability. So environmental sustainability basically says that the trees, in this case the cocoa trees, but whatever it is that's being grown, and its supporting and dependent ecosystems are managed in a way that they will be healthy and thriving 100 years from now, right? And then the economic sustainability part of that is there needs to be enough money in the system to be able to support the environmental sustainability goals. And I think what Penelope is talking to here when she talks about a business model overhaul to make sure that a greater share of the spoils go to the farmers. It's this economic sustainability component that supports the environmental sustainability component. And Penelope, if any reason you're looking at this in the future, or you just happen to be watching right now, and you think that I've misrepresented anything, or you'd like to add anything to it, you know what, I haven't liked that, so I'm going to do that right now. But too many fat cats are still prowling around preventing change. And actually, I mean, this is a segue. This coming Friday, I'm going to do the follow-up to this episode, and it's going to be what are the impediments to change? All right, so I think that's going to be really very, very interesting. So why aren't we seeing the changes that we want to see, or the ones that are suggested here? All right, so okay, so here's a response. It's from a LinkedIn user who is not identified, who says that much of the regulatory framework being developed does not sufficiently listen to and respond to the voices of smallholder growers and producing countries. And I'm going to assume that is the governments of producing countries. Absolutely yes. I mean, I think that things like living income and living income differential and the whole notion of fair trade, who decides what it is fair, for example, have to do with, people in producing countries, right, telling people in consuming countries, what people call the global north, right, people in consuming countries are our ideas and our values that we impose on people in producing countries, what people call the global south. I like producing and consuming rather than this geographic designation. But yeah, absolutely, that the regulations are written from a perspective in this particular respondent's mind that does not sufficiently take into account the actual needs, actual requirements, actual desires and wants of individual smallholder farmers, which we'll get to because I think that's a very interesting thing, and producing countries. So yeah, thank you very much for making that observation. So I respond to Anthony, properly functioning is the key, and to what it is that he's talking about. He does make that point, right? Right. One that requires continuous improvement, absolutely, a properly functioning using the due diligence system. But then I bring in an organization called the FCC. The FCC is the Federation of Cocoa Commerce. And a large percentage, if not all of the cocoa that is exported from West Africa, specifically Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, but I believe also Nigeria and Cameroon, is exported under contracts which are written by the Federation of Cocoa Commerce. And is there something that the Federation of Cocoa Commerce could do to bring this issue to the fore and to write into their contracts support for many of the things? Right. And then there's another point which I'm thinking about right now in a different note, which I have also written about on the Chocolate Life, which is about the fact that whenever you send out a container, about 25% of the gross weight of the container is waste in some form. And when we're talking about sustainability, when we're talking about other issues related to structural changes in cocoa exporting, should we be paying attention to waste reduction as a part of this at all? And so just to make things more complicated, one of the reasons why I'm thinking about that right now is because next week is going to be Confectionery Live. People may know that I'm the technical editor for International Confectionery Magazine, so I've got two panels, a panel and a presentation next week at Confectionery Live. I'll put the link to this in case anybody wants to join it and participate in any of the conference sessions. But I'm thinking about this aspect as a part of my presentation, which is on sustainable packaging for next week. And so this has been on my mind, and I thought I would interject it. Is there, so for example, is one thing that we might change about cocoa and chocolate related to the fact that there's just this enormous export of waste, right? Each one of these, so for example, jute and polypropylene bags, grain pro bags, all have their own recyclability challenges, and they all have their own supply chain issues related to waste, as do the pallets, as do the container dressing, as do the humidity control packs that get thrown in there. These are all, supply chain issues that need to be addressed. And so should we be thinking about this? Anyway, so I threw that in. Anthony replies, every intervention that we could think of stands or fails with its implementation. Absolutely. We have lots of examples of really good ideas, but because the implementation was not thought through, or there were people who were trying to game the implementation system, has failed in one way or another. He says the FCC hasn't played a big part in this, but he doesn't really expect them to going forward, which I think is an unfortunate realization of what's going on, because the FCC plays such a huge role in I'm going to make this a little bigger for people to be able to read it a little better. So, so because so much cocoa is exported out of West Africa under FCC contracts, I think it represents a lost opportunity, right? So he's talking about, so Anthony talks about post-harvest loss here. And this is something we'll get into in a later series of comments. Any efficiency gain, waste and loss to be efficiency gains, which is very, very interesting, because I understand where Anthony is coming from here, but all of the waste or loss, which is part of the export, so it's from the port of export going forward, is not anything which is borne by the farmer. It becomes an externalized cost of the big makers, and I think it needs to be considered separately, because I don't know how it affects the actual productivity of the farm, which is, I think, where Anthony is coming from. So any efficiency gains only help farmers in the short term. After 2 to 3 cycles across history, across commodities, any efficiency gains achieved by farmers will be met by the market lowering prices. And there's examples of this further on down. So net income gains over time are virtually non-existent. Sure, it's better for consumers and offers. So the only two things that have structurally helped farmers at the beginning of the supply chain are at the beginning of the supply chain specifically, are regulations and farmer organizations. This is why those two interventions are the way forward. But I only asked for one intervention, one thing. Yeah, so he says, Anthony then goes on, I missed the part of the question about other side streams would fall under the due diligence regulation. Yes, the idea is for a proper due diligence regulation to be applicable for both upstream and downstream supply chains. So I think this is a really good representation, or a really good presentation of the position that Anthony has, and I'm going to assume, unless told otherwise, that it is the position of the Voice Network, that the regulatory framework is incredibly important, and we need to think about the proper implementation of these regulations. I want to take a quick break before we jump into Anna's point, is to remind everybody, you're watching The Chocolate Life Live, and today we're talking about a topic which is, if you could make just one change in the worlds of cocoa and chocolate, what would that one change be? Now, I did this a little differently from what I normally do, which is I asked the question on my social media, so on LinkedIn and Facebook, and we're now looking at some of the responses from the LinkedIn stream. And you can go to my LinkedIn profile, and you can go read these yourself. But I'm reading them through here. I also want to remind everybody who's watching, whether you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, go into the comments and just do a quick shout out. Let me know where in the world you are connecting from. I'll get that up on screen. Say hello. I always like to know what the international range of my audience is on every live stream. And then if you have a question or you have a comment, you can also put it in the comments. I'll get it up on screen, and I'll get it voiced, and we'll get it acknowledged, and perhaps we can get an answer for it. So Anna comes in and says that her suggestions would be to give farmers and workers a basic income, delinked from volumes of cocoa production. So releasing the farmers, freeing the farmers and their families from financial stress, allowing them to invest in their farms, children's educations, and other businesses as they like. And so this is earlier, you may remember that Terry Collingsworth from International Rights Advocates says that he thinks that this would be a relatively easy thing to do. Um, I am less sanguine about how easy it might be to do. Huge amount of politics involved on what the actual amount of money would be as part of this basic income. And not only that, it has to be not just farmers, but all workers. So just basically the notion there should be a basic income which supports a certain lifestyle, although I don't know that's the right word either. But there needs to be this basic income, not just for cocoa farmers, but for all farmers and all workers. I know that there are experiments in the United States, in Canada, other parts of the world that show these can be incredibly beneficial to health and welfare of the people who receive the monies. It would be interesting to see how this would be implemented, could be implemented in a farming economy. We'll figure out how that works. So I said, is she talking about a universal basic income? And she says yes. Anthony responds, UPI would be a great step. And then we're talking about the upcoming CHOCOA. So for people who are unaware, there's going to be a virtual CHOCOA session this summer. And then their CHOCOA, the next in-person version, is going to be next January or February. Again, I'll put links in the post for that, and perhaps Rutger Bregman. I had never heard this name before, so I asked if there is a particular person on LinkedIn. If you want to go, you can find the person on LinkedIn and find out who Rutger Bregman is that Anthony and Anna are talking about. So I wanted to make that connection. So Sean, people know that I have a direct connection with Sean. I went with him on his first trip to a producing country back in 2005. That was Ecuador. I also went with him on his first bean buying trip. That was to the Soconusco region of Mexico, and then to the Barlovento area of Venezuela the next week. And he talks about, number one, the one thing that he would change is more money to farmers. And I don't think anybody is disagreeing with that. The one change we need to do is to figure out how to get the farmers paid so that they're no longer living in poverty, and they no longer are have a financial incentive to engage in illegal labor practices. We need to make sure that that there is enough money in the system. The economic sustainability goals. Economic sustainability needs to be there's enough money in the system to enable us to be able to achieve the other sustainability goals that we need, one of which is to preserve environmental sustainability, so no more deforestation. Yay, that would be an important goal of economic sustainability. But there's also an aspect of sustainability which is social sustainability. And social sustainability is farmers live in communities, and we need to make sure that the communities are healthy and thriving. Also on this 100-year time frame. So more money to farmers, but it's also more money to communities in aggregate, which I think is really, really important, because the farmer does not live alone. Usually, the farmer lives in context with other people. Now, I want to say that if people do not know the name Howard Yana Shapiro, you should go learn about his background. He and a colleague, Louis Gravetti, wrote one of the biggest books on cocoa and chocolate. It's a history of chocolate book. I'll put a link to it. And He was a Mars Fellow for a while, and you can see he's a distinguished senior fellow at a bunch of places. So Howard says in response to Sean's response of more money to farmers, where do you begin? So how do you define, what do you mean by more money to farmers, right? Are you talking about profitability for the farmers? Right? Do you get there from productivity? How does environmental stewardship fit into the more money to farmers, right? So again, this is the environmental sustainability aspect of economic sustainability. There needs to be enough money to be able to support the environmental sustainability goals. So good governance, good management. Now I got to say that this good governance thing is a value, I believe, of consuming countries. This is where people in the EU, the United States, NGOs are saying, you know, we have this idea about how organizations need to be managed and run. And so, if you, cooperative of farmers in Cote d'Ivoire, want to benefit from the largesse of our certification or other kinds of system, you need to govern yourself in ways that we think, right, are appropriate, not necessarily ways that you think make sense for you. So social inclusion, long discussions for each of these issues. Absolutely. Howard, if you're watching today or you see it anytime in the future, we've been talking about these things for at least 20 years. Under the context of the Harkin Engel protocol, these are issues which have been part of the discussion to solve illegal labor and other things in the supply chain in cocoa. Then what about the arc of habitat loss, inequality in the supply chains, illegality or irresponsibility throughout production to the store shelf, reforestation? So absolutely, when we're talking about affecting change and we're talking about how to give the farmer more, how to make sure that the farmer has more money, right? It's not just a matter of saying to the farmer, we're going to, instead of having $2.50 a kilo for cocoa, we're going to send you $4 a kilo for cocoa. I mean, it's not as simple as that, because there are ripple effects, knock-on effects, both up this chain and down the chain, and all of these things need to be considered. They need to be modeled and gamed out. That's one thing where modern technology is real good. We could run Monte Carlo simulations on these things. We could run them millions of times over the course of the day. We could figure out, what are the best ways that we could work with these complex interdependent variables. That's a really, really interesting idea. But one of the things that we don't know is what happens if somebody puts their thumb on the scale and starts gaming the system. But Howard is absolutely right. These are very, very complicated issues, right? And then they're complicated. Is this financially viable? Right? In other words, what does this do to the cost of chocolate? And will consumers still purchase chocolate if the price goes up radically? There's technical feasibility. Absolutely. Could it be done? Environmental sustainability, which I think is, all of this is being done in support of environmental sustainability, and financial viability is a part of economic sustainability. Operational deliverability, which is how do we do it? This is the proper implementation that I think Anthony is alluding to previously. Social and political. I mean, when we talk about social sustainability, there is a larger political environment all of these things are happening in. People may remember that the government of Ghana went to the government of Switzerland and said, we're not going to export cocoa beans to you guys anymore. There was some, I believe, political grandstanding there, which didn't represent the reality of the situation, but it's nonetheless something that was done. We need to be very fair, understand. And how does this, all of these things affect the thinking, programming, funding, and monitoring of all the above? Lastly, is now the moment to induce change. And of all the things that I really have to disagree with what Howard is saying here, this is the point I would have to disagree with, right? Is that it is decades past the moment to induce change. There have been opportunities to do this in the past. Big Chocolate, quote unquote, has been promising to do many of these things for at least 20 years. It is way past the time, right, to introduce these changes. Big Chocolate had the opportunity to because they said, no, we'll regulate ourselves, we'll police ourselves. They've had the opportunity to fix these problems themselves for over 20 years. And every time they've reached their self-imposed deadline, they kick the can down the road another 5 years. So Howard, I have to exactly disagree with you here, although I would be really, really interested to understand what you have to say about this. In that, this is way past the time. And I wonder what it is, Howard, again, if you could just, what is it about now, right, that makes it the wrong time to do it? I would really be interested in understanding your thinking about that particular comment. So Anthony says, Sean, exactly, we need to give the farmers more money. And then Sean replies to Howard. He says it's not complicated at all. Where to begin, you ask? Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that you're Mars, and Sean is reacting to the fact that Howard used to be on the Mars payroll at some level or another, and you use cocoa beans for stuff you make, and you pay the farmers more. All the other stuff you said is part of the obfuscation problem that farmers have had to endure from Big Chocolate for far too long. Yes, I suppose Mars could pay more for their cocoa beans, but the challenge is that Mars, which is a private company, doesn't exist alone in an environment. So even though Mars as a company might like to do this, what it would do is it would render their products on the store shelves less competitive. They'd have to raise their prices. And so even though Mars is a private company, Cargill as a private company, don't have the pressure from shareholders to do specific things. That if they want to be able to remain competitive, they're going to have to engage in many of the same kinds of activities that their big competitors do. So I think that there is a challenge there, Sean, just for any one company unilaterally, at least any one of the big chocolate makers or any one of the big cocoa brokers, of doing this on their own. Of course, if I'm a small chocolate maker playing in a very boutique specialty craft chocolate I can go and do whatever it is that I want in terms of paying whatever it is that I want, because the issues with respect to competition at the grocery store shelf are very, very different. So Howard says, yeah, he retired from Mars. He says he's not sure what he means by obfuscation. I have trouble believing that someone like Howard, who is as knowledgeable he is about everything, is unaware of the greenwashing claims that Big Chocolate as a whole make, right? And in fact, the greenwashing claims that many NGOs who purport to want to report on the industry to effectuate change are making as well. My point was, all of those activities have to be at least considered understood before one blunders forward, much like almost all of the programs till this point supposedly solving cacao production. And that I do have to agree with, right? Anything that is considered and proposed needs to look at this systemically, right? And I think that anytime you look at these systemically and you don't actually take into account very large scale simulations on mathematical models which enable you to change starting conditions in particular kinds of ways and understand how very small changes in input will affect the outcomes of things. None of this is done. And I actually don't know that any research on this has been done. And it would be very, very interesting to see about putting together a mathematical model in order to be able to figure it out. But when Howard uses the word blunder, absolutely right. There has been hundreds of millions of dollars spent over the course of the last 20 years in support of attempts to meet the goals of the Harkin-Engel protocol, and the problem has not been fixed. And in part because it is being done piecemeal and it is being done voluntarily. One of the things that Anthony says, it needs to be moved out of the voluntary realm into the mandatory realm. And I believe that he is correct in that sense. Paying farmers more, a living wage, is just one of the steps. How about better planting material that is higher yielding, pest and disease resistant, allowing some portion of farmers' land to be replanted with nutritious food crops for their family, as stunting in children is running rampant in the rural sector? His point was that simply saying Big Chocolate does not solve anything. simply saying big chocolate does not solve anything is correct. However, pointing out and holding up big chocolate as the reason why we are in this position and the reason why there are no real effective changes have been made over the course of the last 20 some odd years, I think is appropriate there. And Sean responds to that. We'll get there. This is a structural problem that has existed for 50 to 75 years. It's probably existed far longer than that. We know that Cadbury left the island of Sao Tome in the early 1900s because of slavery on the island. All that did is it didn't stop slavery in the cocoa supply chain, it just moved it from one part of the world to another part of the world. But these are issues which are endemic, right? The structural problem that Howard points to is endemic to colonialization, right? And what we've got now is aspects of neo-economic imperialism where we are trying to preserve the status quo under the guise of doing good, right? So all the players in the cocoa industry need to reorient their activities and their responsibilities, including the farmers. And I would say starting number one with the farmers and with the farmlands, right? And we'll get to my point next week about changes. What are some of the impediments to change? So Sean responds to this. Right. So as I said, saying big chocolate orients the discussion to the top 8 or 10 players, which is really, really important. We need to make sure that, we hold the big companies that are responsible, most responsibility for impeding change, put their figurative noses to a figurative grindstone. Howard points out that paying more money, even doubling the yields for 450 kilos per hectare, won't do much of anything. Low yields help drive the cycle of poverty and deforestation. Pay more money is only part of the solution. It is not a panacea, right? So I'm going to go jump past this. I mean, it's a really, really important discussion, right? And I want to jump past this because I know what it is that Anthony is going to say in response to this, which is we've been trying the purely agronomic approach, which is we want to make the farmers more productive. So if they've been producing 400 kilos per hectare, if we can get them to 500 kilos per hectare, that's a 20% increase in income. No, or is it? Or is it, right? And one of the things I read through this in great detail is that one of the things that Anthony does is he presents some charts which show the effects of increased yield on farmer incomes. And what we learn, and this was said earlier, is that the more you increase the yield, the more you reduce the price on the local market. And so there is this delicate balance that needs to be done that says, yeah, you're right, is the farmer earning more for more productivity or are they earning less? And this graph, which was presented by Anthony, I have asked him what the source of the graph is. I think it is the Cocoa Barometer. I've asked him to let me know what that is. And here we find another way of looking at those same figures, which is what happens when you increase the price, right? What does it do for income? And what you'll see is that the greater the yield in a large community, what happens is the price goes down, and above at a certain point, the more you produce, the more money you lose. And this is a basic aspect economics that I think a lot of people fail to understand. And as you can see, what I've done is I've said, I've asked Anthony to provide the source for these graphs, and hopefully we'll get that back. And what I will do is I will make sure that that gets put into the post for today's live stream. So Brigitte is a colleague of mine, a storyteller. We met in person for the first time at the Northwest Chocolate Festival. I think it was in 2015. We discussed a book that she had put together. So Brigitte says she seconds what other people are saying about stronger wages. She also adds that getting the general public better informed about and engaged in the issues is also critical. Many of the reasons to choose high quality chocolate over junk candy, from health to the environment. I'd love to see more people choosing to buy from smaller chocolate makers. I'd be very interested to know if anyone here is working on any initiatives in that regard. To which I would say, Brigitte, I think that anybody who is working on the issues of trying to improve cocoa quality or improving farmer income, is working hard to educate the public about why these things are important. Unfortunately, there's a lot of sensationalist reporting around this, which is confusing. I've been involved in a couple of, I spent some time, outside of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram on the r/chocolate subreddit on Reddit, and I can tell you that I am disappointed by the number of threads which are just all about, this chocolate is just too expensive, and mass market consumer brands that are being too expensive. And there's an enormous amount of resistance when I point out that, one of the reasons why this product is so cheap or so inexpensive on the store shelf is that the makers of it rely on illegal labor in order to get the product to the shelves. Many makers, not all of them, do. And so, if you like the idea of there being the blood, sweat, and tear of child slaves as an ingredient, not listed in the label in your chocolate, then continue to believe that you're paying too much for your chocolate. So Anthony, who's a big aficionado of fine and flavored chocolate, I know that from our interactions at Chocoa in Amsterdam, says he couldn't agree more. At the same time, we need the bulk cocoa farmers to also be escaping poverty. And I think this is really important. And it's one of the challenges I have with thinking about fine cocoa and fine chocolate and the use of the word fine, is because if we define fine, right, as, basically Trinitarios and Criollos, what we're saying is that the work of 99% of the cocoa farms in the world is not fine, and therefore they don't matter, or they don't matter as much, which I think is morally wrong. I don't think it's supportable. And so when we think about cocoa and chocolate, we need to think about all cocoa, all chocolate, and all of the farmers, and not just cocoa farmers, but we have vanilla farmers and sugar farmers, whether it's beet sugar or cane sugar. There's a very, very complex supply chain here which goes on, and we tend to focus on cocoa farmers, but there are a number of interdependent um, supply chains, which could include the people who grow the hemp, which is used for jute bags, the people, right, who spool the polypropylene, which means we're talking about petroleum exploration in the Amazon, perhaps. I mean, this is it's like this is a rabbit warren that we can dive down, and it can lead in many, many places, and we need to say how far are we willing to go and follow the chain. Brigitte comes back and says that she agrees with that, and also not advocating for either or. Great. We would, however, advocate to stop adulterating chocolate with PGPR, which is an emulsifier, which is a replacement for lecithin, or often used in conjunction with lecithin, TBHQ, which is a preservative, corn syrup, artificial flavors, and other ingredients. And this is also interesting to know, because we're not just talking about chocolate here, we're talking about chocolate candy and candy bars. I don't know how much chocolate per se is made with corn syrup, but if we're talking about the nougat or anything or other things, I can see corn syrup as being used in the fillings and centers that are used for candy bars. And she says, listen, she doesn't want them in her chocolate for the same reason she doesn't feed them to her kids in other foods, knowing that it will not happen overnight. But I would say, Brigitte, the industry has had more than 20 years to work on these things, right? And to some extent, the pursuit of profits is a race to the bottom, and because of its focus on short-term returns, right? And returning money to investors. And so that's one of the impediments to change. So Lynn Lockwood, Lynn has been a friend of the Chocolate Life for some time. She's involved in some of these anti-slavery efforts in the UK. And so she says her change would be that changes are developed and directed by cocoa farmers at origin, including the thoughts, expertise, and voices of those who are most excluded. Then she goes on to say, witness many people in the industry, even those who are regarded as doing good, calling cocoa farmers lazy. We even have a craft maker who labeled his bar the lazy cocoa grower because the farmers would not sort the beans for him. All right, so Right. And so I think this is an aspect, I would agree with Lynn, that a lot of what it is that is being done in this area is top down. Again, we have people in consuming countries who, after centuries of exploitation, have developed morals. And what they're doing is they're saying, we want you people in the producing countries to now abide by our morals, and we're going to ask you to pay for the privilege of that. And that's where I think how fair trade works, where we have ideas about the way things should be done. We're asking you to adopt those ideas, but we're asking you to pay for the privilege of adopting those ideas. That's what certification fees are. And then they don't take any economic responsibility. So they leave the farmers who are certified, the cooperatives that are certified, with 100% of the economic risk, which again contributes to this notion, in my opinion, of neo-economic imperialism. Right. So we should not be doing anything that says without the participation of those crucial to what we are trying to change. And I would agree with that. And I would say that when we have these conversations, we need to make sure that big chocolate is not at the table, right? Because if you're negotiating the price of cocoa and your big buyers are at the table, they are going to be intimidating the farmers who don't have as much representation and don't have the experience that lawyers and other trained negotiators do. I would argue that the discussions around setting the fair trade premium actually put a negative price pressure, because the cost of doing business in Ghana and the Ivory Coast are different, but the fair trade premium for both countries is the same, which means that one of the two countries had to say, well, I'm willing to accept less because it puts my cocoa at an economic disadvantage. And so, absolutely, Lynn, we need to make sure that the people who have been consistently underrepresented become overrepresented, and that the people who have consistently been overrepresented, who have the bargaining power, all of the bargaining power, because of the power of the purse in these occasions, are in fact don't have the same access that they have traditionally had. So Jack Stein, who is one of the founders of Chocoa, I've been working with Jack and his partner Carolyn Lubers on Chocoa for, I want to say, since 2013 or 2014. So he says, after consideration, he would like to introduce an overarching objective to all sustainability measures, voluntary or mandatory, which would be the autonomization of cocoa farmers. Right. So cocoa farmers must develop into entrepreneurs that operate within the context of legislation. Right. So I think that I understand what it is that Jack is saying here when he says autonomization. And this is something that I was working on in a project with the federal government of Mexico and the state government of Tabasco around their cocoa farmers. What we wanted to do is we wanted to make them more aware as business people. We want to make them better business people, right? And I think that the challenge here, Jack, and this is where I would have to agree with you. Yes, I mean, for example, Ingeman has a training program where the idea is that they teach the farmers enough about business so they manage their farm as businesses, right? And so my question is all right, when you mean by entrepreneurs, do you want the cocoa farmers to become more self-actualized and take control of their selling their own cocoa, right? And so I would disagree that a small farmer, I was in Colombia last summer, and it was 2 hours on burro back to get to the place where they could drop off cocoa. Asking those cocoa farmers to be entrepreneurs, I think, makes no sense, right? If I have a community where there are a bunch of farmers, absolutely right. And the way I would say this is, if I can, my thought about this is, what we want to do is we want to right now, we have the individual smallholder farmer, and then we have cooperatives, most of which tend to be very large groups, right? So hundreds or thousands, so they can be certified. I think that one of the things we might do when it comes to this autonomization that you're talking about would be to find another level of organization, which is sort of based around the idea of a group of farmers who together can produce at least one long container of cocoa. right? So at least 25 metric tons of cocoa. And these farmers would be able to help each other, and then they would be able to, from a labor perspective, from other resources perspective, but then buyers would be much happier when it comes to purchasing a container of cocoa rather than like 500 kilos of cocoa. And that somehow there needs to be a mechanism to support this kind of organization without requiring this, the creation of a formal legal entity, which is a cooperative, which has a part-time management, a full-time management, a democratically elected management. There needs to be something in the middle there, right, in order to be able to make this happen. And it's recognized explicitly in laws and other frameworks within these countries. But Jack, I think it's a really, really good idea. Again, I don't think that turning every cocoa farmer into an entrepreneur, right? Because my point would be here is that the individual smallholder farmer, as long as they remain an individual smallholder farmer, is never going to have bargaining power. They're not going to have any power, right? And so what you need to do is you need to find a way to enable them to federate, right, in ways that are different from very, very large legal cooperative, and to encourage it and to be able to support that, so that they can pool resources and produce enough cocoa that they can attract the attention of buyers and therefore have better leverage when it comes to the prices that they charge. My opinion. Jack, if you think differently, if you think I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, please, when you get a chance to read this, put this in the comments. Or if you're a member of the Chocolate Life, you can go down and add your comments onto this page on the Chocolate Life, which I think is really, really important to do. So if you're not a member, just click on one of the join buttons. I'm logged in, but this would be a join button, my little avatar here. If you weren't a member, you just click on that. There's always a free membership, but this episode is sponsored by all the members of TheChocolateLife.com. Free members and premium members. If you'd like to support what it is that I do here, the only economic activity that supports the Chocolate Life is memberships. And so I appreciate your support of that. For the last couple of minutes, this took a little longer than I thought it was going to. As a matter of fact, when I started off, I thought I was going to have trouble getting to the end of the episode with just the LinkedIn's posts. I want to say two quick things. I did get a couple of posts on Facebook, and so you can go to Facebook and you can see their text here. I also wanted to play, I got one video, and I want to share that video with you.
If there could be one thing that I could change in the world of cocoa and chocolate, it would be human trafficking and forced labor. It is unthinkable that this type of horrendous practice is still going on in our times, and we must do everything possible to abolish it. I think we need to hold accountable the corporations, individuals, any company, government that is profiting from this. Because there's nothing worse than a human exploiting in the worst type of form another human being. So for me, that is definitely the number one thing. Of course, there is sustainability, environment, everything that has to do with community development. That's very important as well, and we need to work on it simultaneously. But I do think that the main objective or our main force should always be like we need to make sure that slavery is not part of cocoa or chocolate, of course.
And so what I want to do is I want to thank Lila Carvajal, who is from Ecuador and is at Cocoa Supply, or for supplying a video response. I did ask people if they didn't want to write something on Facebook or LinkedIn to send me a real quick video response. So Lila, thank you very, very much for doing that. And that video is embedded on the post page, and so you can listen to it again. What I wanted to close out with today, and literally have 20 seconds in the hour, was to talk about an idea that I presented. And this is way back in 2009 when I first presented this. So I stood up this little group on Ning. I no longer have, I can't, I created it, but I can no longer log in. I don't have the credentials for it. I have no idea why I can't do it anymore. But in any event, my idea was something called 5% for farmers. And to do this 5% for farmers as a way of getting farmers to have more income through the creation of a sort of value added tax system. So my idea being is that every time cocoa changed hands, right? So when it went from the farm to the middleman, from the middleman to the cooperative, somebody bought it and put it on a port, then a broker sold it to somebody else, there would be a value added tax. I said 5% because I thought it was alliterative. I don't think 5% is the number literally. But the notion is that this is the reason, this is a reason for doing a traceable supply chain, right? If you had a traceable supply chain and you knew where the cocoa came from, you would be able to then trace back to the farmer, right, where the value added tax on their beans, so the profit from the upscale increase in value through the supply chain, right, would be returned to the farmer, right? And this would go all the way through to the retailer, right? So that the retailer says, I bought it from the distributor and I'm making, 40% margin or 50% margin, whatever it is. I'm going to take 1%, 2%, whatever that number is, and I am going to earmark it right through this voluntary system back down to the farmer. And I think this is a way of saying, and this is to some extent what Sean Eskenazi is doing. And I think that there is a no, I don't think that. I think there is a direct acknowledgement that I need to make in terms of Sean's the contract. So he buys his cocoa at above market price, usually fair trade premium and above. But what then he does is that he calculates how much profit he makes from the sale and then writes a check back to the farmers for a percentage of the increase in value that's associated with transforming the beans into chocolate. And I think that this is a really, really interesting idea would create as a voluntary system to go and see about implementing. Now, one of the things that I would like, so again, this would be a reason to implement a traceable supply chain so that I could say, oh, it's the cocoa started here and it passed through all of these hands. And I'm not necessarily, blockchain is not necessarily the way to do this. It could be a way to verify things, but I don't think building it on blockchain is the right way to do it. But you could also say that if we have a chain for which there is a gap, so we don't know where it comes from, you could put all that money for which you can't verify to go to a specific farmer or cooperative. What you could do is you could say, we're going to create a fund, and that the farmers who are part of this would be able to apply to the fund for monies to produce special projects. One of the things that I promoted as a part of this, and the link to this is going to be in the page for today's live stream, is the notion that there's no central certification arm here. That what happens is this is all done through tax returns, that the company that is certifying your tax returns under penalty of perjury is the company that signs an additional form that says, here's how much cocoa we bought at these prices, here's what we sold it for, blah, 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 blah. And they would say, okay, a check has been cut to go to this place based upon that. And so by distributing the responsibility for accounting into companies whose job it is to do this accounting anyway, but also distributing it so there's no single point of failure, there's no single point of perhaps potential corruption, right? We might have, every company might have its own financial auditors, it might have its own accountants, and therefore, if you subvert one auditor, you're not subverting the entire system. So I'm gonna suggest that people go take a look at 5% for farmers, and in particular, this post here is some mission statement ideas, right? And so there's some things. So I think it's just this is something that I've abandoned. But I wanted to bring up is in the context of today's episode, and actually to see if anybody thinks it's a good idea to resurrect the idea, to say, here's something that we could do as a group, independent of what it is that Big Chocolate does, to create a framework that we could put into practice relatively easily in order to be able to effectuate change. And that it would be collaborative, it would be public, and all the kinds of things that I think are good about the way the internet can be used to effectuate meaningful social change, right? And with that, I want to remind everybody that this is the homepage of The Chocolate Life. Today's live stream is sponsored by all of the members of The Chocolate Life, and I encourage everybody who is watching to become a member of The Chocolate Life, support what we do, a free member or premium member, as well as if you're watching this on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, give the video a like, share it, subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow me on Facebook, connect with me on LinkedIn, and let's grow this community and see if we can, as a group, help make the world of chocolate a safer and happier place. And I want to say before I sign off that on Friday, there's going to be a follow-up to this episode. And the follow-up to this episode is going to be, what are the impediments to the kinds of changes that people talked about and wrote about on the LinkedIn post? What are some of the impediments to change that we see? And what might we be able to do if we can identify them, how we might be able to lower those barriers to change. And with that, I want to remind everybody, until next time, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you are doing